further, the next attribute which is necessary for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is, as the author states, he mentions, ويجب في حقه تعالى الإرادة وهي صفة قديمة قائمة بذاته تعالى يخصص بها الممكن بالوجود أو بالعدم أو بالغنى أو بالفقر أو بالعلم أو بالجهل إلى غير ذلك وضدها الكراهة والدليل على ذلك أنه لو كان كارها لكان عاجزا وكونه عاجزا محال. The author states here that the next attribute is Iradah. The Arabic term is Iradah, and the translation of that is will. W-I-L-L, will. And he says Iradah, will, is necessary for him subhanahu wa ta'ala. It is a pre-eternal attribute subsisting through his entity subhanahu wa ta'ala, with which he determines possible existence or non-existence, independence or dependence, knowledge or ignorance, etc. The proof for that is where he compelled, he would have been unable, and his being unable is impossible. Its opposite is compulsion, in Arabic al-karaha. So the two attributes we're looking at here is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala possesses irada, possesses will. And the opposite of irada, the opposite of will, is compulsion. In Arabic that is karaha. So irada is necessary for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and karaha is impossible for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Meaning, having will is necessary for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and being compelled is impossible for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The first thing the author does is he explains what this sifa is, and as I mentioned in the previous attribute of qudra, we as incapable and finite human beings cannot understand the exact definition or how exactly do the sifat of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala work, but we define them according to our understanding, but we also say that our understanding is limited and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not restricted to the way we define these particular attributes. The author defines it by saying that it is a pre-eternal attribute subsisting through his entity with which he determines possible existence or non-existence. So, as I mentioned last week, the attribute of qudra and the attribute of irada work together. Okay? So we mentioned when we defined the attribute of qudra, we said that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala possesses the attribute of qudra. And it is through the attribute of qudra that something is taken from non-existence and brought into existence, and something that is in existence is taken from existence and taken into non-existence. That's what the attribute of qudra does. So what does the attribute of irada do? That's what the author states. He says, he determines possible existence or non-existence, independence or dependence, knowledge or ignorance, etc. Let me make that easier to understand. So the attribute of qudra is the attribute which does the creating. And the how that thing will be created, that is through the attribute of irada. For example, let me give you an example. I was created through the qudra and the power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay, so I was brought into existence through the attribute of qudra. But how is that existence defined? Meaning, will I be dark-skinned or will I be pale-skinned? Will I have large hands or will I have small hands? Will I be male or will I be female? Okay, all of these determination on all of these extra qualities that I possess, that is through the attribute of irada, through the attribute of will for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's what it simply means. So the qudra does the creation and the determination that happens in the sense that how that thing will be, how that thing will look, or how that thing will behave, etc. All of those things are done through the attribute of irada. However, in a simple understanding, if you just understand that whenever something is created, both the attributes of qudra and irada are at play. Meaning both of them work together to bring that particular thing into existence. The dalil aqli for this and the dalil naqli. Let's look at the dalil naqli. The dalil naqli is a verse from the Quran in Surah Al-Hud where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Inna rabbaka fa'alun lima yurid. Inna rabbaka fa'alun lima yurid. What does this translate as? It translates as that God, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is the doer of what He wills. What that simply means is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does whatever He wishes or whatever He wills to do, He carries that out. So this verse of the Quran affirms that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is murid. Murid not in the sense that we use it with a pir and a murid. Murid here in its literal meaning, which means to intend something or to will something. So this verse shows us that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has an iradah, He has a will. Another verse, إِلَّا مَا شَاءَ اللَّهِ إِنَّهُ يَعْلَمُ الْجَهْرَ وَمَا يَخْفَى, that only that occurs whatever Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wills. Okay? And we say this in our common usage, insha'Allah, whatever Allah wills. So these verses of the Quran and multiple ahadith show us that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala possesses an iradah. That's the dalil naqli. The dalil aqli for this is quite simple, and as I mentioned last week as well, from now onwards the dalil aqli will become very simple because it's going to always go back to the previous one. So we've done the difficult dalil aqlis, for example the dalil aqli for wujud, etc, etc. Those were the difficult ones. Now they all will relate and go back to them ones. So the dalil aqli for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala having irada and having a will is what? That the proof for that is, were He compelled, He would have been unable, and His being unable is impossible. That if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was compelled to do something and He didn't do it out of His own will, rather He was compelled to do something. If you are compelled to do something, then you become ajiz, meaning incapable. And we literally, in the attribute before, we made incapability impossible for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay? And that dalil aqli is associated with that sifat that we mentioned last week. Yes? So the attribute of will is proven through that if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did not will something, rather He was compelled to do something, then that would make Him incapable, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala being incapable is impossible. Okay? It's impossible for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to be incapable. That's a very simple understanding of the attribute of iradah. So again, qudra and iradah work together to bring something into existence. Once it's come into existence, how it looks, how it behaves, etc., all of that is done through the attribute of iradah, through the attribute of will. The scholars here mention that the attribute of iradah is similar to the attribute of qudra. In what sense? In the sense that the iradah only relates to those things which are possible. Okay? Just like we mentioned last week, the qudra of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala only relates to those things which are possible. It does not relate to that which is impossible, and it does not relate to that which is necessary. In a similar manner, iradah only relates to those things which are possible. It does not relate to those things which are impossible, and it does not relate to those things which are necessary. The reason being is exactly the same as the reason we mentioned for qudra, meaning it will either result in something that is necessary becoming possible or impossible, or it will result in tahsilul hasil. Tahsilul hasil, as I explained previously as well, just a reminder on the explanation, tahsilul hasil is a philosophical term which means achieving that which has already been achieved. And the simple example I gave was of the light, but let me give you a different example to make it easier. For example, I say to Ma'ad, he's already sitting down, and I say to him, Ma'ad, sit down. Okay, that's tahsilul hasil. He's already sitting down. I'm commanding him to do something which he's already doing. It's tahsilul hasil, meaning there's no reason for it. It's a logical fallacy for that to happen. So those were the reasons as to why the iradah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala only relates to those things which are possible. Now, what are the types of things that occur because of the iradah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? So the ulama mention 6 things, and they say that the possibilities that the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will determine are as follows, which are wujud, existence, and adam, non-existence. Okay? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will the existence of a particular thing, and then through His qudra, He will bring that into existence. And if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wishes or wills the inexistence of a particular thing, He will will that through His iradah, and the qudra will make that happen. Okay? Those are the 2 things. Those are easy. The next 3, 4, 5 and 6 are what? The third one is the sifat, which means it is through the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that a person or a thing's sifat, its qualities come into existence. Okay? For example, let's use Zaydan as an example. Yes? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through His will, through His iradah, intended to create Zayd. Okay? So the first thing is intention, which is Iradah, will. So Allah willed that Zayd exist. Through His Qudra, Zayd came into existence. Now that Zayd has come into existence, it is again through the will and the Iradah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala which determines the Sifat, the qualities of Zayd. What are the qualities? For example, is Zayd going to be tall or is he going to be short? Is Zayd going to be black or is he going to be white? Is Zayd going to be a male or is Zayd going to be a female? Is Zayd going to have big hands or is he going to have short hands? Etc, etc. All of these qualities that a human being possesses, okay, this is just one example and it relates to everything else. For example, you can take the same thing for a tree. Is the tree going to be a short tree or a long tree? What type of a tree will it be? From which genus will that tree be from? All of these are determined through the Iradah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay, so the existence comes through Qudra, and then the qualities of that particular existence comes through the will and the Iradah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The next thing, the fourth thing that the will determines is what? Al-azmina. Azmina is the plural of zaman. Zaman means time. Azmina, times. For example, let's take Zayd as another example. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wills to create Zayd. He creates Zayd and his attributes and his qualities are determined through the will. For example, Zayd is a tall, slim, pale male. Okay, that's through his qualities. Now, this Zayd that's been created, will this Zayd come in the 21st century or will he come in the time of Sayyidina Adam? Will this Zayd come in the time of the Prophet or will he come in the time of Sayyidina Isa, for example? So in terms of the linear timeline, where will this Zayd that's been created, where will he come into existence, or when will he be born into this world? So it is through the will and the Iradah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that his azmina, his time is determined through that. That in which time will Zayd come into existence and when will he be born into the world. That is determined through the will and the Iradah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's the fourth one. The fifth one is amkina. Amkina is the plural of makan, meaning in which place will this Zayd that we're using as an example, in which place will this Zayd exist? Okay. For example, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala now wills that this Zayd be created in 2020, that's when he's born. But where is he going to be created? Where will he be born? Will he be born in the United Kingdom? Or will he be born in Africa? Or will he be born in America? Where will he be born? So the place is determined through the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the last and final thing is the sixth thing, which is the jiha, which is in which direction will this Zayd be created and where will he be? For example, is this Zayd or this person or this thing that's being created, is it going to be an earthly being or is it going to be a heavenly being? Okay? Where is he going to exist? Is he going to exist in the direction, meaning is he going to be beneath the water or is he going to be above the water? Or is it going to be on the earth or is it going to be in the heavens? Okay? Where in terms of its jiha, its direction, will this being exist? For example, obviously we gave the example of Zayd, and obviously a human being will only exist on the earth, okay? But now to understand jiha, it could mean different things. For example, in the same process, let's say we're talking about a fish now, okay? So the direction of its existence, its jiha will change. A fish will not be created, or Allah will not will a fish to be on the ground. Why? Because a fish does not survive on the ground. So the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will determine that this fish or this whale or whatever type of fish it is going to be created and it will live and reside underwater. Okay, so all of these qualities and all of these positions and places and its time limits, all of these are determined through the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay, that's regarding the attribute of Iradah and the attribute of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala possessing will. So through the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, all of these things are determined. And there's a very important point over here, which is not necessarily related to the Aqidah part, but whenever I read this aspect and you study the attribute of will and Iradah for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it increases us in our gratitude to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay? Because if the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was anything other than it is right now, we could have been in a different place. Okay? So every single time you think of something that you are in this particular place or you are in this particular form, or I have short hair, I have long hair, and my face looks like this and my face looks like that, etc. All of these things that people become insecure about and complain about, you have to realize that you had no part to play in that. Okay, that is through the will and the iradah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And once you understand that and you stop feeling insecure about yourself, or maybe thinking about what if I wasn't born in this family and I was born into the family of the royal monarchs of United Kingdom, then I would have been fifth in line to become the prince. Okay, people do think about these things. I'm not just mentioning as an example. Yes, people think about these things. What if I was like this, and what if this happened to me, that happened? These what ifs are what goes against the will. Okay, because it's Allah who willed that this is how it will be. And when you think about it like that, and then you ponder upon the verse where Allah says that Inna rabbaka fa'alun lima yurid, that your God and your Lord does whatever He wills. Whatever Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wills, He does. So when you start to question these things and say, I wish I wasn't born here, and I wish I wasn't like this, what are you actually doing? You are questioning the iradah and the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's why the ulama say that whenever a person starts to bring out these what if questions, what is he in reality, what is he doing? He is being ungrateful. Okay? You are being ungrateful because you are questioning the iradah and the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay? Whenever you think, and we're prone to thinking like that because we're human beings. Whenever we think like that, what should we do? We should think that if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He could have willed it better for us, but He could have also willed it in a manner where it was not as we have right now. For example, what if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala willed that you were born in a third world country in a slum, and that's how you grew up and that's how you lived? Could He have willed that? Yes, He could have. Why? Inna rabbaka fa'alun lima yurid. Your Lord does whatever He wills. So He could have willed that, but He chose not to will that for us, and He chose something better for us. Okay? So every time we think about the will and the iradah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you think about it in a manner that Allah willed whatever was best for you. Okay? Whatever was best for you. Not that it can't be better, and not that it can't be worse. It can. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala willed whatever was best for you. The ulama say, for example, they question that if a person is born poor, and the poor person questions the decree and the will of Allah, that why did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make me poor when He could have made me rich as well? When a person goes through that thinking, what did the ulama say to him? The ulama say to him, what if you were rich? How would you have spent that wealth? Imagine you had £1 million and you spent that on clubbing, on drugs, on going out and wasting. That money did not become a means of your betterment, rather it became a means of you being disgraced in this world and disgraced in the hereafter as well. Okay, so that's why the scholars say if you change your mentality and you think about the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in this manner, you will be more grateful for what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given to you. That was a side point, but it's a life lesson that you learn from this particular attribute of will and iradah for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So that's the two attributes which are iradah, will for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which is necessary, and the opposite of that is compulsion, which is karaha, which is impossible for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. What does that mean? That means Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is never compelled to do a particular thing. Okay? Nobody can compel Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to do something. For example, there's a long debate. I don't want to go into the full details of it, otherwise we'll be here for hours. But the debate is that if a person does a good deed and a person lives a really good life in the servitude of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is it necessary for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to reward that person? Or is it necessary for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant Jannah and paradise to that person? Yes? The simple answer is nothing is necessary for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Meaning He is not compelled to do anything. He does it because He wills to do it. So nobody can make anything wajib or necessary upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala unless He makes it necessary upon Himself. Okay? For example, is it necessary for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to have mercy? No, it's not. It's not necessary. But it is necessary. Why? Because Allah made it necessary upon Himself. Okay? So in and of itself, it's not necessary for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to have mercy. But He does have mercy. Why? Because He made it necessary upon Himself. In a similar manner, one would say, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will reward the believers. Why? Because He has promised to reward the believers. If He did not promise, then He wasn't compelled to. But because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says to us multiple times in the Quran that He has promised paradise for the believers, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will grant paradise to the believers. Okay? Otherwise, that will result in something which is known as going against a promise, which is obviously impossible for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If Allah promises something, He will carry out that promise. Okay? He will not go back on His word and not grant us Jannah, for example. Okay, so that's the attribute of will and the attribute of compulsion for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The first being necessary and the latter being impossible for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The next attribute, again, these are now very simple attributes but important nevertheless. The author states that the next attribute is وَيَجِبُ فِي حَقِّهِ تَعَالَى الْعِلْمُ وهي صفة قديمة قائمة بذاته تعالى يعلم بها الأشياء وضدها الجهل والدليل على ذلك أنه لو كان جاهلا لم يكن مريدا وهو محال. In this particular attribute, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, or the author states, that knowledge, that's the attribute which is necessary for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Knowledge, have ilm. And the impossible attribute is al-jahl, which is ignorance. Okay, so the author states, knowledge, al-ilm, is necessary for Him subhanahu wa ta'ala. It is a pre-eternal attribute subsisting through His entity subhanahu wa ta'ala, with which He knows all things. The proof for that is, were He ignorant, He would not have been willing, which is impossible. Its opposite is ignorance, al-jahl. So the two attributes we're looking at now is al-ilm, which is knowledge, which is a necessary attribute for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and the opposite of this attribute is al-jahl, which is ignorance, which is impossible for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The author states that it is the attribute of knowledge which is necessary for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and the dalil aqli and the dalil naqli for that. Look at the dalil naqli. The dalil naqli is where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in multiple verses throughout the Quran. For example, in Surah Al-Baqarah, He says, إِنَّكَ أَنْتَ السَّمِيعُ الْعَلِيمُ. Okay, that verily it is you, meaning Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, who is the all-hearing and the all-knowing. Al-Alim, the knowledgeable, the all-knowing. In another verse, He subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَفَوْقَ كُلِّ ذِي عِلْمٍ عَلِيمٍ, that above everyone possessed of knowledge is the all-knowing. وَفَوْقَ كُلِّ ذِي عِلْمٍ عَلِيمٍ, above everyone who possesses knowledge is Al-Alim, the all-knowing, which is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So that's the dalil naqli for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala possessing the attribute of ilm, which is knowledge. And he says now the dalil aqli, the rational evidence and the rational proof for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala possessing the attribute of knowledge. The proof for that is, were He ignorant, that if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was ignorant, He would not have been willing, which is impossible. Okay? So you relate this back to the previous attribute, that if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was ignorant, then He wouldn't have been willing, because an ignorant person cannot will. So if Allah subhanahu, like we've just proven that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala possesses a will and He is the willing. So for Him to be willing, He must have knowledge. Okay? If He does not have knowledge, then He can't be a person who is willing. Okay? So the attribute of ilm is necessary for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because if He were ignorant, He would not have been willing, and Him not being willing is an impossibility, as we've just proven in the previous attribute. And the opposite of ilm is jahl, which is ignorance, and that is impossible for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. A few points over here regarding the knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The first thing is that the knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is nothing like the knowledge of creation. Okay? What is the knowledge of creation? The knowledge of creation is learnt from other people, from experiences. That's how we attain our knowledge, from experience or from teaching. Then that knowledge is stored in our mind, okay? And then we use that knowledge. That's a simple understanding of how humans get knowledge and how they retain that knowledge and how they use that knowledge. The knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is completely indifferent, okay? Why? The verse of the Quran that we covered previously, لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٌ, that there is nothing like Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the knowledge of creation is very different or completely different to the knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. A few points here. His knowledge, so the knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is complete, it's perfect, and it's not by way of conjecture and not by way of doubt. Okay? So a lot of the times the knowledge that we have, or the knowledge we seem to think we have, is by way of conjecture or by way of doubt. What are those things? The terms we use in Arabic are dhan and shak. Okay? Dhan is where you assume something. So you don't have complete knowledge of that particular thing, rather you make an assumption based on particular instances or particular things, and you put them together and you reach an assumption. So you've not reached complete knowledge, it's an assumption. So Allah's knowledge is not an assumption. In a similar manner, we have a different thing which is known as doubt, which is known as shak. So when you have shak, when you have doubt, you think possibly this may be the thing where I don't know completely. Okay, that is shak, that is having doubt. The knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is free from shak, and it's free from dhan as well. It's free from conjecture and it's free from shak. For example, when we do dhan, when we assume something, that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us not to assume things. In the Quran, He makes it very clear and explicit that do not be people who assume things. Why? Because a lot of the times assumptions lead to sins. Why? For example, people will take A, B, C and they'll put it together and reach a conclusion which is D, which is completely against reality. Okay, you know exactly what I'm talking about. I don't want to go into too many details. For example, you'll say, oh, this particular person, he does this, and then he also does this, therefore he does this. Okay, that's your logical process and your logical thinking, but that conclusion that you've reached is not knowledge. Okay, it's an assumption, it's dhan. And majority of the time, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that our assumptions are sinful, because what happens when you begin to assume things about people is you begin to slander them and curse them and say things which are against reality, and that comes back upon you and you become the one who is sinful. That is dhan. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is free from that. Okay, so the knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not in a manner where Allah puts A, B, C together and reaches the conclusion D, for example. Okay, that's not the knowledge. Allah's knowledge is complete and it's perfect. Shak, an example for shak is you are doubtful about a particular thing. Okay, so for example, somebody asked, did Zayd go to London yesterday? You say, I think he did. Okay, so as soon as you say I think, it's a doubt. You do not know by way of certainty that he went, and you also do not know by way of certainty that he did not go. So your answer is, I think he went. That is doubt. Okay, that's what shak is. The knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not comprised of shak. There is no doubt in the knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Everything that He subhanahu wa ta'ala knows, He knows it through complete and perfect knowledge. That's the first thing. The next thing is, He knows all the universals and all the particulars. Universals and particulars are philosophical terms which basically means kulliyat and juz'iyat. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has the knowledge of kulliyat as well as juz'iyat. Let me give you an example. For example, a kulli in English is a universal, and a juz'i is a particular. A universal, for example, is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows or has knowledge about the human beings as a species. Okay? As a genus, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows that there exists Allah created the species of human beings. That's what the kulliyat are. Does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala know about every single fard, every single particular within that species? Yes or no? Yes, He does. That's a particular. For example, the universal is human beings. I am a particular of that human being. You are a particular. Every single one of you are a particular, a juz'i of the kulli, which is human beings. So there are a group of people who argued that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala only has the knowledge of the universals and He does not have the knowledge of particulars, which is against the creed of the Ahlul Sunnati wal Jama'ah. Our belief and our creed is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has complete and absolute knowledge of every kulli, every universal, and He has the knowledge of every juz'i, every particular as well. Okay? The next point is that His knowledge, the knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is pre-eternal. It does not increase or decrease. Okay? So for example, our knowledge, okay, it increases over time. As we learn new things, we experience new things, our knowledge increases. And sometimes we are prone to forget things. Okay? Some memories that we created and we cherish for a while and then we forget about them. So our knowledge increases and decreases. But the knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not increase. Let me make that clear in a better example. For example, next week a person named Bakr is going to be born. Okay, next week somewhere in Oldham, a person or a child will be named Bakr and he will be born next week. Does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala know that that child will be called Bakr and he will be born in Oldham and he will grow up and become a scholar, for example? Does Allah already know that, or will he come to know that when it occurs? Okay, that's the question. Let me repeat that again. A child will be called Bakr and he will be born in Oldham next week and he will grow up to become a scholar. Does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala already know that, or will he come to know that when it occurs? Okay, our knowledge is limited. We cannot know that this child will become a scholar until it happens. So in our knowledge, we will only know that information when it occurs. For the knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it is absolute and it is complete. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows everything that has ever happened, that is happening or will ever happen. He already knows that, meaning there is no increase in the knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay? So it's not that Allah does not know what will happen and then He comes to know it. He has always known what is happening, what is going to happen, and what has happened previously. He always had that knowledge of everything. So if, for example, you were to say, a child will be born, his name will be Bakr, he will grow up and become a scholar next week, not become a scholar next week, sorry, he'll be born next week and eventually become a scholar. Does Allah already know that? Yes. Okay? Allah knows that before it's even occurred, before it's even happened, because there is no increase and decrease in the knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Finally, so the attribute that we affirm is knowledge for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and the attribute that we say is impossible for Allah is al-jahl, for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to be ignorant. Okay? What does jahl comprise of? Jahl comprises of everything that is incompatible with knowledge. Okay? So everything which is incompatible with knowledge, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is free from that. Okay? And we make that impossible for Allah. For example, forgetfulness, sahv, in the Arabic language, sahv. Sahv is a term you use it in your day-to-day. For example, when you have to do a sajdatul sahv, you have to do a prostration of forgetfulness because you forgot something in salah. That's sahv, forgetfulness. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is free from forgetfulness. Why? Because it is incompatible with knowledge. The only reason you you forget something is because that the knowledge of that particular thing fades away in your mind. For example, you, instead of praying 3 rakats, for Maghrib, you end up praying 4 rakats. How did that occur? How did that happen? Because the knowledge of you praying Maghrib 3 rakats went further back in your brain and you forgot that knowledge and then it came back to you. Okay? And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is free from that. So Allah is free from sahaf, forgetfulness. Why? Because it is incompatible with knowledge. Another thing is dhuhul, which is distraction. Okay? So the knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is free from distraction, from dhuhul. Let me give you an example. For example, a mother is cooking. A mother is cooking food and the child is playing with their toys, and the mother becomes distracted and the child ends up hitting that toy on their head, for example. Okay? That happened. Why? Did the mother have the knowledge that the child was playing with toys? Yes, she did. Did the mother know that there is a possibility that the child could hurt themselves with them toys? Yes, she did. So she had all that knowledge. Then how did that child get hurt? Because the mother became distracted. Okay? Dhuhul. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is free from that. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, His knowledge is free from distraction. Okay? And the final thing here is the knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is free from ghafla. Ghafla is heedlessness. Okay? And the knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is free from that. So, in summary, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala possesses the necessary attribute of ilm, knowledge, and it is impossible for Him subhanahu wa ta'ala ignorance, which is jahl. Those are the 3 attributes that we have covered there. The next attribute is regarding, the next couple of attributes are quite simple and easy as well. The next attribute is al-hayat, which is life. Okay? And the author states regarding that attribute, وَيَجِبُ فِي حَقِّهِ تَعَالَى الْحَيَاةُ وَهِيَ صِفَةٌ قَدِيمَةٌ قَائِمَةٌ بِذَاتِهِ تَعَالَى تُصَحِّحُ لَهُ أَنْ يَتَّصِفَ بِالْعِلْمِ وَغَيْرِهِ مِنَ الصِّفَاتِ وضدها الموت والدليل على ذلك أنه لو كان ميتا لم يكن قادرا ولا مريدا ولا عالما وهو محال. The author states that the next attribute which is necessary for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is al-hayat, life. Why is life necessary? He says it is necessary for Him subhanahu wa ta'ala. What is life? It is a pre-eternal attribute subsisting through His entity subhanahu wa ta'ala, which validates His being attributed with knowledge and the other attributes. The proof for that is, were he dead, he would not have been able, willing or knowledgeable, which is impossible. Its opposite is death, al-maut. So the next two attributes we are affirming for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is that it is necessary for Him subhanahu wa ta'ala to possess the attribute of al-hayat, which is life, and it is impossible for Him subhanahu wa ta'ala al-maut, which is death. Okay? These are the two attributes, al-hayat and al-maut. Al-hayat is necessary, meaning life, and al-maut, death, is impossible for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. What's the dalil naqli, the evidence from the Quran or the textual evidence? In Surah Al-Baqarah, the beginning of Ayat Al-Kursi, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Allahu la ilaha illa huwal hayyul qayyum. Al-hayy. So He subhanahu wa ta'ala attributes Himself with the attribute of life. That He subhanahu wa ta'ala is the living, Al-hayy, Al-qayyum, the all-powerful. Al-qayyum was the verse that we used for qudra, and here we're using the same verse, but the particular word we're using is al-hayy, which is being alive and being living, which is necessary for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The opposite of that is al-maut, which is death, and it is impossible for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The dalil aqli, the rational evidence or the rational proof as to why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala must possess the attribute of hayat, life, is because if He subhanahu wa ta'ala was not alive, then He could not have been attributed with these particular qualities. For example, we just attribute qudra, power to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We attributed will and iradah for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If He subhanahu wa ta'ala did not possess hayat and He was not alive, He could not have possessed these particular attributes. Okay? That's the rational proof. For example, we say a person has the ability to walk. Okay, obviously this is just an example, it's nothing related to the divine attributes of Allah. A person has the ability to walk. Now, that person can only walk when he is alive. When he is dead, okay, he can no longer walk. Okay, so when you say a dead man walking, it's a conundrum. Okay, because a dead man can't actually walk. Okay, so the attribute or the quality of walking is only possible for somebody who is alive. If somebody is dead, they cannot possess that quality. So now that you've understood that example, the qualities that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala possesses, like power, like iradah, all of these qualities, they only exist because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is alive. If He subhanahu wa ta'ala were not alive, then these qualities and these attributes would not exist. Okay? So al-hayat is necessary for Allah, and al-maut, death, is impossible for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And there's a particular narration that the author mentions here, well, the person commentating, is that upon the death of the Messenger of God sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and when the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam passed away, people went into a state of shock. Okay? They went into a state of shock, and they refused to believe that the Prophet alaihi salatu wasallam has left this temporary world. Okay? They refused to believe that. So Sayyidina Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiallahu, before Sayyidina Abu Bakr, Sayyidina Umar radiallahu an stood up, and he was also in a state of shock. And he said to the people, if anybody says that the Messenger of God sallallahu alaihi wasallam is dead or has passed away, I will slay their head with my sword. Sayyidina Umar radiallahu an made this statement in shock. Okay? Then Sayyidina Abu Bakr radiallahu an came, and he said to the people, what does he say to the people? He said, whoever worshipped Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam, then verily the Messenger sallallahu alayhi wasallam is deceased, meaning he has passed away. And whoever worshipped Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then know that your Lord is ever living and there is no death for your Lord. Okay? So what was Sayyidina Abu Bakr saying in our particular example here? He was affirming that it is impossible for a God to die. Okay? It is impossible that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala dies. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is ever living. He is al-hayy. He is always living, and He is attributed with the attribute of hayat, life. Further, he states in this particular instance, there might be a question as to why Sayyidina Abu Bakr said this. Sayyidina Abu Bakr said this because nobody worships the Prophet ﷺ. We honor him, we respect him, we love him, we revere him, but we are not like the Christians who began to worship Sayyidina Isa ﷺ. Okay? The Prophet ﷺ is not God. That's what Sayyidina Abu Bakr was conveying to them. That the Prophet has passed away because he was a human being after all. Okay? The best of us, 100%. He was the best of human beings to ever be created. He was the beloved of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But he was not God. That's why he tasted death. And the promise of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is what? كُلُّ نَفْسٍ ذَائِقَةُ الْمَوْتِ, that every soul shall taste death. Therefore the Prophet ﷺ tasted death, and then he was brought back to life as per our aqidah of the Ahlul Sunnati wal Jama'ah. But Sayyidina Abu Bakr made the very famous statement that your God, the one that you worship, your Lord, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He is ever living and He shall never ever taste death. So those are the two attributes, Al-Hayat and Al-Maut. Al-Hayat, life, is necessary for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and Al-Maut, death, is impossible for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There's three more attributes which are pretty straightforward and simple, which are what the author states. To be honest, I won't read the Arabic, it's quite long. The author states that hearing and sight, as-sam'u wal-basar. As-sam'u wal-basar, those are two attributes. And then the third one is al-kalam. As-sam'u wal-basaru wal-kalam. These are three attributes which are necessary for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. As-sam'u means hearing, al-basaru means sight, and al-kalam means speech. As-sam'u wal-basaru wal-kalam. Hearing, sight and speech. These three qualities and attributes are necessary for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and the opposite of them is as-sumamu, okay, which is deafness, and al-ama, which is blindness. And the opposite of al-kalam is al-bukmu, which is dumbness. Okay, so the three necessary attributes are as-sam'u wal-basar, which are hearing and sight, and the third one al-kalam. The opposite of sam', hearing, is deafness, which is as-sumamu, and the opposite of al-basar is al-ama, which is blindness, and the opposite of kalam, speech, is al-bukmu, which is dumbness. These are 6 attributes in total. 3 of them are necessary for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and 3 of them are impossible for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. What is the dalil naqli for these 3 attributes? Okay, 2 verses of the Quran. The one of them we've done multiple times, which comes throughout the Quran. وَهُوَ السَّمِيعُ الْبَصِيرُ, that He is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as-sami', the all-hearing, al-basir, the all-seeing. And another verse of the Quran which affirms the attribute of kalam, speech for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is وَكَلَّمَ اللَّهُ مُوسَى تَكْلِيمًا, and your Lord, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, spoke with Musa alayhi salatu wasalam, which is a verse from the Quran, and it refers to the conversation between Sayyidina Musa alayhi salatu wasalam and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So these 2 verses prove to us that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala possesses these 3 attributes, which is as-sam'u wal-basaru wal-kalam, which is as-sam'u, hearing, al-basaru, sight, and al-kalam, speech. Finishing off on this, the question arises, why do we affirm these particular attributes for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Okay, there's no logical reasoning over here. Why? Because we cannot think of a logical reason as to why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has these particular attributes. Okay, like the previous ones, there were logical reasons for them to be there. For these particular attributes, we do not know. What we say is because He subhanahu wa ta'ala affirmed these attributes for Himself, therefore we affirm them for Him subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay? That's one thing. We do not know the reason as to why these attributes are there, but they are there. Why? Because Allah affirmed them for Himself. Number 1. Number 2, the most important, is we affirm transcendence for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which is what? In Arabic, tanzih. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is completely transcendent, and this comes back to our attribute that we covered, al-mukhalafatu lil-hawadith, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is dissimilar to created beings. The person will say that if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sees, and He hears, and He speaks, I hear, I see, and I speak as well. So what's the difference? Our seeing, our hearing, and our speaking is completely different to that of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in every possible sense. Okay, let me make that easier for you to understand. How do I see? Going to the science of things, going to biology, you see because of your eyes. Okay, there are multiple layers within there, your pupil, all these, I forgot the terms, I did them in GCSE, it's been a long while. Yes, all these terms that you have for all these things inside your eye. If one of them goes wrong, what happens? You lose your eyesight, okay? Or your eyesight decreases. So our ability to see is limited because we can only see with our eyes. Our ability to hear is limited because we can only hear through our ears. Can you hear through your finger? No. So all the sound waves that you hear, they go through your ear, which gives you the ability to hear. Can you speak without having a tongue or a mouth? No. So all our attribute of seeing, speaking and hearing, all of these are limited in the sense that we require particular organs to be able to hear sound and to be able to see light and to be able to produce words from our mouth. We are in need of all of these things. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not in need of any of that. Okay? What do we do here? We affirm transcendence for Allah. That Allah does not need an ear to hear. Allah does not need an eye to see. And He does not need a mouth to speak, etc. What we also affirm is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's speech is not like the speech of humans. And the seeing of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not like the seeing of humans. And the hearing of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not like the hearing of humans. Okay, so these are the things that you must do when you affirm these particular attributes. For example, we speak. How do we speak? When we move our mouth, okay, our tongue moves, there are particular airs that goes around our mouth which allows us to produce these words that we say. Okay, when you study tajweed, those of you that are hufaz over here, you study tajweed, Qari Sahib probably tells you when you're going to pronounce the letter dad, hit your tongue against your side teeth over here. Okay, that's how you pronounce the letter dad. Can you pronounce the letter dad if you don't move your tongue at all? No, you can't. Can you pronounce the letter ba without touching your lips? You can't. Okay, so we are in need of touching our lips to be able to articulate the letter ba. We are in need of moving our tongue to the right of our face or to the left. The letter dad can be done on both sides to be able to produce that sound. That's what our speech is. Our speech requires us to do that, which then requires us to produce letters. Those letters then turn into words. Those words turn into sentences, and those sentences turn into paragraphs. That is our speech. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's speech is completely different to that. Okay? Then there is a longer debate with regards to, or not the debate rather, an explanation with regards to the Qur'an. In a simple manner, what you understand, that the Qur'an and all other divine revelations are the speech of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and the words that you are reciting is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created upon the tongue of Sayyidina Jibreel alayhi salatu wasalam, which Sayyidina Jibreel then brought down to the Messenger sallallahu alayhi wasallam, and that is what we recite. Okay, so the words of the Qur'an are created by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala upon the tongue of Sayyidina Jibreel alayhi salatu wasalam. So these are the three attributes: as-sam'u wal-basaru wal-kalam, and the opposites are as-sumamu wal-ama and al-bukum, and those are impossible for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So those are the attributes that we have covered. Alhamdulillah, we've covered quite a few attributes today. Inshallah, next week we have 7 attributes which are known as Sifatul Ma'nawiyah.